She also reported the sightings to the Air Force, and because she was worried about radiation. In coming years, with Betty suffering from disturbing dreams and Barney developing an ulcer and anxiety, the couple sought mental help. The two met with Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist and neurologist who specialized in hypnosis, which was a mainstream technique at the time. Through months of weekly sessions, Simon helped the couple piece together what they think had happened. A vessel had landed on the Hill's car, putting them to sleep. Afterwards, gray beings walked them up a long ramp and into the spacecraft. Once inside, the Hills were separated, taking turns in an examination room that had curved walls and a large light hanging from the ceiling. Each was asked to climb on the mental table, onto a metal table. The table was so short that Barney's legs hung over the side. During the examinations, the beings removed Betty and Barney's clothes, plucked strands of their hair, took clippings of their nails, and scraped their skin. Each sample was placed on a clear material, not unlike a glass slide. Needles, connected to long wires, probed their heads, arms, legs, and spines. One large needle, about 4 to 6 inches long, was inserted into Betty's belly, a pregnancy test that left her twisting in pain. Throughout, a being Betty and Barney called the leader watched from the side. After Betty's examination ended, the beings rushed back to her room excited. They discovered that Barney's teeth could be removed. Betty laughed, explaining that Barney had dentures, a fact of human aging that the beings struggled to understand. Later, alone with the leader, Betty asked where the craft had flown, admitting she knew little about the universe. The being joked with her, saying, "If you don't know where you are, there wouldn't be any point in telling you where I am." Under hypnosis, she drew a star map shown to her on the ship. Now, in 1965, the Hill story was picked up by a Boston newspaper. After that, everything changed. Everything. The quiet couple story became the subject of a best-selling book and a movie starring James Earl Jones. The upstanding civil servants had become celebrity abductees. And this is where the skeptics started to examine the Hill story. Now, the Hills weren't the first to spot a UFO or even to report an abduction, but their story did capture the nation's imagination and was so widely publicized it helped shape how we talk about alien encounters and abductions to this day. In other words, it was the first of its kind. Before the Hill story, alien encounters were friendly, according to Christopher Bader, a professor of sociology at California's Chapman University. But once the Hill story became better known, abduction accounts shared certain characteristics, such as medical examinations and missing time. Aliens with large heads and big eyes, dubbed grays in UFO circles, became the classic sci-fi staple. Experts of all stripes have tried to explain why intelligent, otherwise mentally stable people came forward with these experiences. Many psychologists say sleep paralysis and hallucinations played a role. Leading questions during hypnosis, the main way most abductees have blocked their stories, could also be a factor. Now, those who report abductions might see the world a little bit differently. According to research, one of the strongest predictors of false recall is a vivid imagination. This type of group scores high in magical idealization and is more likely to believe in ghosts and tarot card readings. Now, some believe the Hill story was simply a myth in the making, with the supernatural beings, vulnerable procrastinists, and otherworldly journals that are often the hallmark of legends. Many points to the stress of being an interracial couple Living in a predominantly white state in a turbulent era was an issue. You have a biracial couple at the time who obviously was not easy to be a biracial couple, said Bader. But what those aliens were, gray in color, was a mixture of black and white. That means something, according to Bader. Now, abductee stories also depend on first-hand accounts, the most vulnerable form of evidence. Memories can be distorted by stress or distraction, or even manufactured. When a false memory is in place, psychologists say the brain works to fill in the details. Now, past experience also shapes a human perception. Barney, a World War II vet, thought the head gray looked like Hitler and seemed menacing. Betty, meanwhile, who had been excited to see the aliens, bantered with the gray who performed her medical examination. She said the alien even agreed to give her a book to bring back to Earth with her, although the other crew members on the ship overruled that statement. In this way, alien abduction and encounter stories have helped psychologists and psychiatrists understand the human brain, its defects, and the weakness inherent in memory and first-hand accounts related to the paranormal. Now, what we see here, especially under less than ideal observational conditions, can be heavily influenced by our prior beliefs and expectations. NICAP, remember the precursor to MUFON, their scientific advisor cross-examined the couples and found their account credible. The Air Force Project Blue Book would ultimately dismiss the story, determining the unexplained craft could be explained by natural causes, hinting that the couple hadn't seen a spacecraft, but only the planet Jupiter. Now, for his part, the psychiatrist, Dr. Simon, never felt the Hills had made up their story. He concluded that Betty had dreamed the abduction and Barney had absorbed her story, especially since many of the most vivid details matched descriptions of dreams Betty had jotted down after the event. I believe in the honesty of these people, he said in a 1970s radio interview. Now, after the hypnosis sessions, Simon speculated that Barney's recollection of the UFO encounter was possibly a fantasy inspired by Betty's dreams. Simon thought it was the most reasonable and consistent explanation. Barney rejected the idea, noting that while their memories were consistent in some regards, there were also portions of their narratives that were unique to each other. Barney was now ready to accept that they had been abducted by the occupants of the UFO, although he never fully embraced it as Betty did. Though the Hills and Dr. Simon disagreed with the cause of their distress, they all concluded that the hypnosis sessions were effective. The Hills were no longer tormented by abduction anxiety. Now, when the series of hypnosis sessions was complete, Simon wrote an article about the Hills for the journal Psychiatric Opinion, and he explained that the conclusion of the case was a singular psychological aberration, a departure from the normal. Okay? Now, before, in a 1990s article, a journalist, Martin Kottman, suggested that Barney's memories revealed under hypnosis that he might have been influenced by an episode of the science fiction television show The Outer Limits, entitled The Bolero Shield, which was broadcast about 2 weeks before Barney's first hypnotic session. The episode included an extraterrestrial with large eyes who says, "In all the universes, in all the unities beyond the universes, all who have seen eyes have eyes that speak." The report from regression featured a scenario in which some respects were very similar to the show. In part, Kottman wrote, wraparound eyes are extremely rare in science fiction films. I know of only one instance, and they appeared on the alien episode of an old TV show The Outer Limits, entitled The Bolaro Shield. A person familiar with Barney's sketch in The Interrupted Journey and the sketch done in collaboration with artist David Baker will find a frisson of deja vu creeping up his spine when seeing the episode. The resemblance is much abetted by an absence of ears, hair, and noses on both aliens. Could that be by chance? Now consider this. Barney first described and drew the wraparound eyes under hypnosis back in February 1964. The Bolaro Shield broadcast was on February 10th, 1964. Only 12 days separate the two instances. If the identification is admitted, the commonness of the wraparound eyes in the abduction literature falls to cultural forces, according to Dr. Baker. Now, those of you that remember The Outer Limits, I mean, that was a bizarre, strange, cutting-edge science fiction show in the early 1960s. It was different from The Twilight Zone. It was more like, in fact, it was scary, bizarre, and actually featured a lot of strange creatures, strange happenings. Back in the early 60s, there was The Outer Limits, The Twilight Zone, and another television show called One Step Beyond. Those were the paranormal, science fiction, bizarre shows of the day. All have heard of The Twilight Zone, of course, Rod Serling's account. Some have heard of The Outer Limits. Few have heard of One Step Beyond. But those were the three shows that were popular. And a lot of people think that these alien abductions, like the Hills, had their roots set in shows like The Outer Limits and One Step Beyond and The Twilight Zone, because the alien abduction stories really didn't start until after these television shows began. Others would say these television shows began because of the alien abductions. So what was first, the chicken or the egg? It's hard to tell. In fact, it's impossible to tell. Now, the story of Betty and Barney Hill could be easily explained in many of the ways that I mentioned. Some of the explanations make sense. Some of the explanations are totally ridiculous. In another study, the Air Force said, yeah, if it wasn't the planet Venus they just saw a weather balloon. Well, if you look at the detail of the description and the happenings, this wasn't a weather balloon. This wasn't the planet Venus. That was just the way of Project Blue Book discounting anything that was out of the ordinary. And that's kind of what they did back then, back in the day. Anything that was out of the ordinary, they just discounted it. In fact, you can go back several weeks to my podcast about J. Allen Hynek, and he was the head of Project Blue Book and was in charge of debunking all these people and putting an end to all these alien stories, all these UFO stories, all these abduction stories. So the government was vested in discounting all these stories, which I always thought was very, very bizarre. Because to me, if you're going to form a committee, form a group, have an organization like Project Blue Book, and put all this time, money, and effort into it, wouldn't you think that the goal would be to find out the truth? Whereas their goal was to debunk the stories. Now, back then versus now, things are done differently. Now the government has actually admitted that, you know what? UFOs are real. In fact, they don't call them UFOs anymore because UFOs are just, that's what the people with the tinfoil hats believe in. They're called UAPs, UAPs, unidentified, or UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena.